The title of this paper is Emerald and Gold, Polycrates' Ring and Asclepiades AP 12-163. Of all of the epigrams that make up the corpus of the Hellenistic epigrammatist Asclepiades of Samos, surprisingly little ink has been spilled on AP 12-163. The poem features two lovers named Euboeus and Cleandrus, who serve as the climax to a preamel, which claims that Eros has united them instead of other pairs of beautiful things. One of these pairs is emerald and gold. In their treatments of the epigram, Alexander Sens and Massimo DeMarco focus on the aesthetic contrast of these materials as a foil to the relationship between Euboeus and Cleandrus. Their differences in luster and color highlight the contrasting similarity of Euboeus and Cleandrus' social status, age, and emotional investment in their relationship. What scholarship has not explored is whether the combination of emerald and gold might have had a deeper significance to the poet, one which would have suggested its inclusion in his preamel. This paper argues that the addition of these two precious materials also hints at a famous piece of ancient jewelry. According to Herodotus, the most prized possession of the 6th century tyrant Polycrates of Samos was a golden ring with inlaid emerald. Such a cultured reference would express Asclepiades' pride in the history and craftsmanship of his homeland, and also enhance the relationship of Cleandrus and Euboeus, since Hellenistic epigrammatists often put learned allusions in their poetry in order to show off their knowledge and to make their commissioners appear well-educated. Let us begin with the epigram in question, which you may find at number 1 on your handout. In this poem, Eros is said to have discovered what beautiful things should be mixed together, not emerald with gold, nor ebony with ivory, nor black with white, but Cleandrus with Euboeus, the blossoms of Peitho and Philia. Unfortunately, the relative clause in the second line is, in the words of Gow, desperately corrupt. As such, it is beyond the scope of this paper, if not the realm of possibility, to attempt a reconstruction of the line that could account for the neuter singular relative pronoun and the use of the optative genoit without on. Despite this textual difficulty, scholarship on the interpretation of the epigram as a whole is decisive. The union of Euboeus and Cleandrus is characterized not by contrast, but similarity. Both Alexander Sens and Italian scholar Massimo DeMarco discuss the harmony and equality of Euboeus and Cleandrus with respect to their social status, age, and emotional investment, which is in direct opposition to the antithetical nature of, for example, black and white. Their equality in social status, which must have been elevated due to the fact that they paid to have this epigram written, is glimpsed through the words "and is so" in the aforementioned relative clause, which appears to be referencing the inherent inequality of the union of emerald and gold. Their shared youth is implied by antheia in the final line, which is anticipated and perhaps emphasized by the anthe in the corrupted second line. This is because, as Sens explained it, it is, quote, commonplace to describe young men and women as having the flower of youth, end quote. Catherine Gutzweller also included this epigram among others featuring reciprocal love between young men, namely Gow page numbers 21 through 23, with the implication that reciprocity is a form of equality. Sens also supported his argument for the similarity of the young lovers with a brief examination of their names. He translates Cleandrus and Euboeus as glory of man and good life, respectively, which are related to the aristocratic values of pursuing kleos and living well. Given the significance of their names, one might be tempted to claim that the epigram is fictitious, but there is no real reason for us to make such an assumption. In fact, according to the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names, in the Aegean Islands alone, the names Euboeus and Cleandrus appear in a few of the same places, specifically Arcasine, Eretria, Rhodes, and Thera. It is then certainly possible that our Cleandrus and Euboeus were real people, and that Asclepiades was inspired by the complementary meanings of their names to construct an epigram that would emphasize the concordant aspects of their relationship. If, as Asclepiades wrote, Eros chose to join Cleandrus and Euboeus because they embody these ideas of harmony, concord, and equality, the precious materials Eros passed over in their favor would naturally have been lacking in those qualities. Indeed, black and white are famous opposites. One is, by its very nature, the absence of the other. The same can be said for ebony and ivory. The union of emerald and gold, on the other hand, is not so simple a case, as these two materials are not traditional opposites, and thus do not, on the surface at least, communicate a lack of harmony in the way the other pairs do. It has been suggested that the aesthetic difference in the luster of metal and the shine of a cut gem is enough to justify the presence of emerald and gold in a preamel made up of pairs which are discordant in nature. There is, however, another explanation, one that emphasizes the juxtaposition between Eubiotis and Cleandrus's Harmonia and the discord inherent in their other 3 pairs. I argue that Asclepiades meant to illustrate the unity of these 2 lovers by contrasting them with a reference to a ring that symbolized a failed and unequal partnership in a sensational episode of Samian history, namely the famous signet ring of the 6th century tyrant Polycrates of Samos. Before the appeal of such a reference can be fully understood, we must first begin with a brief discussion of what little is known about Asclepiades himself. The exact years of Asclepiades' birth and death have eluded scholars for decades, but what can generally be agreed upon is that Asclepiades was born sometime roughly between the beginning of Alexander's conquest of the East and his death. What this means is that Asclepiades was likely not born on Samos at all, but rather in the diaspora that Athens forced upon the Samians in 365, when they expelled them from their homeland. To support this idea, Alexander Sens has pointed to the name Sicelidas, which appears to have been a nickname for the poet. The name has the form of a patronymic, though there is no record of a name in Greek which could account for it. Sens has suggested that this may be evidence that Asclepiades was born in Sicily, or at least to a Samian family that had sought refuge there. The question must then be asked, how much would a person either related to people who had lived in a diaspora, or who had lived in one himself, know or care about the possessions of a tyrant who had ruled his homeland 200 years before he was born? Studies on the impact of diaspora on cultural identity and traditions may have the answer. James Clifford, a distinguished scholar of history and anthropology, stated that diaspora cultures work to maintain community, selectively preserving and recovering traditions, customizing and versioning them in novel, hybrid, and often antagonistic situations. Thus, when the Athenians forced the Samians to abandon their island and physical connection to their history, they also provided the ideal circumstances for the conscious preservation of that history. Moreover, Catherine Gutzwiller has noted that Asclepiades was reportedly an associate of Duris, who was not only tyrant of Samos after the diaspora, but also a prominent historian. Duris and his brother, the comic poet Lyncaeus, were deeply concerned with rebuilding Samian citizen life after the return of its exiled population. By virtue of this association, Asclepiades was exposed to people with a vested interest in rebuilding Samian life and recording the island's history. Given that Polycrates' reign was when Samos reached the height of its power, the story recorded by Herodotus would have been among those deemed worthy of remembrance by the Samians living in and recovering from the Samian diaspora. Something else that should be noted is that Polycrates' ring was of interest to people without a direct connection to Samos. For example, Posidippus, another Hellenistic epigrammatist who worked in Alexandria under the Ptolemies, chose this signet ring as the subject of one of his epigrams, which you can see at number 2 on your handout. As Sens and Gao have noted, Asclepiades and Posidippus appear to have been friends, and Posidippus often imitated Asclepiades' work. Though there is no evidence I can find that would prove Posidippus was inspired to write this poem about Polycrates' ring because of his association with Asclepiades, their apparent friendship and Asclepiades' literary influence on him may suggest that possibility. At the very least, the reputation of the ring extended beyond Samos itself, and indeed seems to have been so great that it persisted into the early Roman Empire. Pliny the Elder claimed that either Augustus or Livia gifted the famed jewel to the shrine of Concordia. However, the gem described by Pliny, which was set into a golden horn instead of the gold band we would expect, is unengraved sardonyx, not emerald. As Charles Seltman in his piece titled The Ring of Polycrates argued, the ring Pliny described is clearly not the one that was owned by Polycrates. The disparity between gemstones aside, Herodotus identified Polycrates' ring as a signet ring, which would have been engraved. That Augustus or Livia lied about the provenance of the stone is well within the realm of possibility, given Augustus's proclivity for exaggerating and misrepresenting events. Nevertheless, the donation of a gemstone of such fame would surely have added prestige to the imperial family, but only if the people in front of whom the donation was made knew about its history. It then follows that the story of Polycrates' ring was one that was known to many people across the Mediterranean, even hundreds of years after Polycrates' own time. It is at this point worth questioning where exactly Herodotus got his information on Polycrates, and whether or not it would have been close to the versions of this story with which Asclepiades would have been familiar. In her article, Herodotus and Samos, B.M. Mitchell examined Herodotus's narratives about Samos and argued that, quote, there can be no doubt that Herodotus's Samian material was obtained at first hand on a visit or visits to Samos, which lasted for a considerable time. His knowledge of Samian proper names, references to the works of Samian artists and offerings in the Horion, his disproportionately long account in Book 3 of Samian Internal Politics, and his generally favorable attitude to the Samians all point to this conclusion, end quote. In particular, his sources appear to have been Samian aristocrats. Additionally, Mitchell defended Herodotus's estimation of the wealth and artistic achievements of Samos under Polycrates, stating that, quote, later sources exaggerated the luxury of Samian life and customs. Ionian trouphe became a well-worn theme, and Samos was an obvious example, end quote. Thus, it can be assumed that the details of Herodotus's account of Polycrates, including the provenance of his ring and the materials from which it was made, would have matched those preserved by the Samian people themselves, and by extension, the version Asclepiades would have been familiar with. Now that the reasons Asclepiades would have been interested in Polycrates have been sufficiently explained, what remains to be shown is how such a reference would have enriched the meaning of the epigram about Euboeotus and Cleandrus. For the answer, we must turn to Herodotus's version of Polycrates' story, which you can find at number 3 on your handout, and can be summarized as follows. When Polycrates gained control of Samos in the 6th century, he made an alliance with the Egyptian pharaoh Amasis II. Seeing Polycrates' excessively good fortune, Amasis reportedly became concerned that destruction was surely looming overhead, and that the higher Polycrates rose, the further he would fall. Polycrates would need to temper his success if he wanted to continue his association with Amasis by giving up the thing that would pain him most to lose. The possession Herodotus claimed Polycrates chose to sacrifice was a signet ring made of emerald and gold. The ring itself would have undoubtedly been of extraordinary value. Emeralds of sufficient size for engraving were rare, and it had also been crafted by Theodorus, a renowned Samian artisan who was credited with marvels great and small by Herodotus, Pausanias, Pliny, and Vitruvius. The ring of Polycrates, therefore, can be seen as the pinnacle of Samian craftsmanship, and on brand with the type of extravagance that was so pervasive in the Ptolemaic court of Asclepiades' day. It was, however, ultimately a sacrifice that the gods deemed unworthy and subsequently rejected. Not a week after Polycrates cast the ring into the sea as a testament to his commitment to Amasis, did it miraculously return in the belly of a fish that was served to him. Amasis took this as a bad omen and dissolved his friendship with Polycrates immediately. J.E. Vanderveen's article, The Lord of the Ring, Narrative Technique in Herodotus' Story on Polycrates' Ring, explains why this may have been. When Polycrates reacts to Amasis' advice, he changes the verb Amasis used algain to asasthai, which he claims carries more of a sense of annoyance than the deep suffering implied by algain. The pleisteu axion has also disappeared, and it can thus be presumed that Polycrates looked among his treasures not for what would grieve him most to lose, but what sacrifice would simply be inconvenient or displeasing on a much lesser scale. The ring, and by synecdoche the materials from which it was made, is therefore not a symbol of Polycrates' commitment to Amasis, but rather of his failure to appease the gods in the face of his success and the dissolution of their mutually beneficial relationship. When Asclepiades sat down to write an epigram for Cleandrus and Euboeotus, he had a veritable ocean of possibilities to choose from to highlight the beauty of their union. It is certainly possible that Asclepiades chose emerald and gold to start his preamel merely because they shine differently in the light. It is also perhaps more than a coincidence that the most prized possession of one of the most famous Samians was also made from these two materials. Asclepiades lived on Samos right after a time when his people had been robbed of every connection to their homeland besides the one thing the Athenians could not take from them, their stories. That Polycrates' ring is also a marvel of Samian craftsmanship and the subject of a fantastical interlude in Samian history makes its use all the more appealing. But while Euboeotus and Cleandrus' harmonia would have made them perfect candidates for Eros to join together, the two elements of a famous ring that led to the dissolution of guest friendship and the public downfall of a prominent Samian would have been quite the opposite. It is no wonder why Eros, in his search for what beauty to mix with what, passed over emerald and gold. Thank you.